Hey there, teacher. I'm guessing if you chose to use your precious limited time to watch this presentation, you're experiencing some undesirable behaviors in your classroom. Am I right? Well, you're in the right place because today I'm going to teach you a framework and strategy that you can use in your classroom as early as tomorrow that's going to help you target undesirable student behaviors in a way that supports them using social stories and purposeful play. So let's get started. Just to be 100% certain, I want to make sure that this presentation is going to be a good use of your time. So you are in the right place if one or more of the students in your classroom are displaying challenging behaviors, or at least behaviors that are undesirable, things that you don't want to continue see happening in your classroom. And or you are in the right place if the social emotional learning curriculum that is provided by your district or program is not doing the trick. Perhaps it isn't complex enough, or it's not hitting on the behaviors that you're seeing in your classroom. Maybe it's just too broad or general. Maybe the curriculum just isn't digging deep enough and you need something more to add on to the provided curriculum. Or perhaps you feel like you're on a behavior management hamster wheel where you just keep seeing the same behaviors over and over again. You're trying to address them in the moment, but the behaviors are reoccurring. And you're tired at this point of saying and doing the same things over and over and over again. If you can relate to any of that, then stick with me. Because by the end of this presentation, I'm going to help you hone in on those behaviors and support your students in a way that they understand. In case our paths have not already crossed, hey, my name is Amber. I teach full day 4K, in other words, 4-year-old kindergarten. We are in a play-based program. My school is located in the greater Milwaukee area in Wisconsin. Our school is a public school, so if you're also in a public school, I fully recognize that there are added challenges when it comes to teaching in the public school system. When I work with other pre-K and kindergarten teachers, my goal is always to help them prioritize play in their classrooms, despite those many challenges that teachers face. And if we have connected before, no doubt you've heard me talk about Play Workshop before, as that is the heart of our play-based program. Before we actually get into the framework, I do want to share a quote with you. Beneath misbehavior often lies a struggling child who is aware that they are not meeting expectations, but unaware or unequipped on how to do so. And that comes from Sarah Boyd. She is a psychologist and child development expert. You can find her at sarahboyd.com. That is not a typo. It is .co, not .com. This quote hits me at my core because in my years of teaching 4K, I have come across so many students who are totally aware that they're not meeting expectations. They're not following the group plan. They're not getting along with their peers. They're not making their teachers happy, but they don't yet have the tools in their toolkit to improve those behaviors. The good news is the framework and approach that we're talking about today, social stories combined with purposeful play, does provide them with those strategies to improve and move forward. I keep referring to this 5-step framework. Now, I do want to give you a heads up that steps 4 and 5 go hand in hand. In other words, they happen at the same time. Step 4 and step 5 happen at the same time. Let's start with step number 1, which is to notice and observe the student behavior. This goes beyond just seeing it. This is really taking time to observe it and try to uncover and dig deeper and figure out what is happening. So let's get into this a little bit more. Okay, so if you find yourself on the behavior management hamster wheel that I referred to previously, here's what might be happening in your classroom. You might notice the behavior in the moment, but because you are a busy teacher and you have a lot of kids in your class and you don't have the support that you need, you are just putting out fires, right? You're managing that behavior in the moment to move on to the next thing. Maybe you're not yet really taking the time to teach the skills that are necessary, but we'll get there. You're putting out this fire and you're managing it in the moment, but then you're moving on to whatever is next because you have so much on your plate. I get it. But then what you're finding is the same behavior is repeating itself or happening again. Maybe the next day or maybe 2 minutes later. And this is where your frustration comes in because it just keeps happening and happening. Here's what we're going to do moving forward. Yes, you're going to notice that behavior because it is going to happen again. But instead of just managing it in the moment, putting out that fire, you're really going to take time to support that child in the moment. And we are going to get to how to do that later on. Then you're going to take it even a step further and you are going to observe that behavior for a period of time. Maybe the behavior happens so often that observing it for one day is enough. maybe the behavior flares up every once in a while, so you might want to take a few days to observe, okay? But you really need to take some time to sit back, watch, and see what's happening. And I'm going to give you some tips on the next slide on how to do that. Once you've observed the behavior and you have some notes, you're going to prepare a social story. And again, I have tips for you in the upcoming slides. Then you're going to use the social story as a tool to discuss what's happening with your student, and you're going to give them suggestions and strategies on how to do better next time. Next, and here's the really important part, you're going to allow the child to play. It's super important that we give our students opportunities to practice the skills that we're trying to teach them, and that can be done through play. Then, during that play, if you notice that the behavior arises, this is where you step in and you guide and support. I told you I was going to give you some tips that you can use when you're observing the undesirable behavior. First of all, if there is no danger, no one is being unsafe or hurt, or at risk of being hurt, try not to intervene. It's really important for you to observe what's happening without your interference. Second, take note of where the kids are. Is the behavior arising at recess, during play workshop, during morning play, at lunch, during math exploration, during read alouds? See if you can find a common thread of when the undesirable behavior is happening. Number 3, try to determine the trigger. In other words, what happened immediately before the undesirable behavior occurred? Is another student involved? Or are other students not at all related? Specifically, what is happening to cause this behavior to occur? Number 4, notice the child's reaction to the trigger. What is the child specifically saying? What is their dialogue? How are they feeling? Are they getting frustrated, mad, sad, scared, nervous? These are all important details that can help you support the child. And tip number 5, write down your observations right away. Try to take quick little notes, even if that means grabbing a Post-it note and jotting down some quick notes so that you can trigger your memory later. Write it down so you don't forget the details. If you're wondering to yourself, well, Amber, why do I have to write this down? Why am I observing? The reason why you're observing and taking these notes is because you're going to use this data to help you create a very specific social story that can support the child best. When you use these notes to create your social story, your student is going to be able to relate. So save those notes. Moving on to step number 2 in the framework, now it's time to prepare a social story that aligns with the behavior you observed. When I say prepare a social story, that can mean creating one on your own or looking for one that was already created by another teacher that would work with the student that you observed. We'll get into that in a bit more detail in a few more slides. Before we move any further, I think it's important for us to talk about what a social story is. So a social story is a learning tool that targets a specific behavior or skill, and it comes in the form of a short storybook. Social stories use simple but powerful words. In other words, the text should be easy for a child to understand and relate to. Social stories also include illustrations or images. I like to use clip art, but you can also use stock photos or drawings if you're feeling artistic. When I sit down to write a social story, I simply open up PowerPoint. Now, you could do this on blank sheets of paper at your desk. You could do this in a Google Doc. It doesn't really matter. Personally, I like to use PowerPoint. These 8 points that I'm about to share with you encompass the outline that I personally use every single time I create a social story. Now I'm going to go over these points with you right now, but on the next slide, I'm going to give specific examples. First, I make a general statement about school, but the statement leads me into the behavior that I'm going to talk about with the child. The next thing I do is I start to narrow in on the behavior that I see the child displaying. I like to start with the positive. So the third thing that I do is identify a positive behavior. So in other words, it's usually the opposite of what the child is doing. The fourth thing I like to do is give a reason why the specified behavior is a desirable behavior, or in our classroom, we call it a green choice. Then I get into the undesirable behavior. So the fifth point that I make is to name that undesirable behavior. I call it out. The sixth point I use in my social stories is to give a reason why the undesirable behavior is a red choice, something we don't want to do in school. The seventh point I make is to help support the child in problem solving. Now, this part of the social story can sometimes get a little bit longer because I like to give the child many strategies for solving the problem. And the eighth and final point, or in other words, how I wrap up the social story, is just to conclude on a positive note. So now let me give you an example of how this can sound. Okay, so let's imagine that you have a student who gets angry very quickly, very easily when something doesn't go his way. And his reaction is to hit or be physical in some other way. First, I go ahead and make that general statement in the social story. Something like, when we are at school, we play and we learn. Remember, the second step is to start leading into that behavior. So I might say something like, sometimes we get to do things we want in school, but sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do in school. Or sometimes things go our way in school, sometimes things do not go our way in school. Sometimes we feel happy, sometimes we feel mad, something like that. So the third step is to identify a desirable behavior. So I might say something like, it is important to try to use calming strategies when we're feeling angry. Next, you would give some reason as to why this is a desirable behavior. So you might say something like, it is important to use calming strategies when we're feeling angry because we solve problems better when we are calm. Then we want to point out the undesirable behavior. We want to call it out so the child can connect to what he or she is doing. So you can very plainly say, when we are feeling angry, we do not hit. Then, of course, you want to give a reason why hitting is an undesirable behavior. So you might say something like, we do not hit in school because it hurts people's bodies and feelings. Next, we want to give the child lots of different strategies or tools in their toolkit for calming down when they feel angry. So you might say something like, when I'm feeling angry, I can calm down by counting to 10. And then on the next page, you can say, when I'm feeling angry, I can calm down by taking deep breaths. Then on the next page, perhaps you might say something like, when I'm feeling angry, I can ask my teacher for help. Finally, you want to end the social story on a positive note. So you can say something like, everyone feels safe and happy when I use calming strategies and keep my hands to myself. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, Amber, I don't have time to create these social stories and you need an easy button, I have some suggestions for you. There are actually free social story libraries available to you right now online. Here are just a few examples. First, I love to go to Tara's website, Autism Little Learners. She has a very expansive free social story library, so go check that out. Some of her social stories are more individual or home-based, but a lot of her social stories are relevant to the classroom setting. ABA Educational Resources is another option. Another website you can go to is the Social Workers Toolbox. They have lots of free social stories available. And finally, a fourth suggestion is All Play Learn. Their website has an expansive library as well. Certainly, you've heard of Teachers Pay Teachers. Personally, I like to go to Teachers Pay Teachers because these social stories are made by teachers, typically for the classroom setting. In full transparency, I do have a social stories collection on my Teachers Pay Teachers website. You can find that at the Cream City Teacher. Deanna Solvender is one of my favorites on TPT because she has so many social story options and they're at a very affordable price. And her social stories are also designed for classroom teachers. A couple more options are Brooke Reagan as well as One Giggle at a Time. They have a lot of social stories that are worthwhile to check out too. Here's another easy button option. Ask your colleagues. Especially if you're working with other veteran teachers, chances are they might have some social stories available that they would be willing to lend to you. My grade level colleague next door knows that I have 2 crates full of social stories. I call it my social story arsenal. So whenever she notices an undesirable behavior in her classroom, she just pops over, she goes to the crates. They're all in alphabetical order. She just grabs what she needs and she goes. Now let's get into the third step in the 5-part framework, which is to actually use the social story as a teaching tool. This is where you're reading and discussing the social story with the child. Allow me to reiterate that you're not just reading the social story. So you're not holding it, reading page 1, reading page 2, reading page 3. It's really important that you discuss the social story with the child and help him or her make connections to what they're doing in the classroom. When you take the time to do this, not only are you bringing awareness to the child, not only are you bringing it to their attention that, oh, wow, I am doing that and that's not safe or that's not kind, you're also providing the child with strategies to improve moving forward. In our 4K classroom, we use social stories in 3 different settings. Depending on what the behavior is, sometimes I do choose to read social stories to the entire class during our focus lesson at the beginning of play workshop, right before they go play. For example, if I'm noticing many of the children in my classroom are having difficulty taking turns, then perhaps I would read a social story about taking turns to the entire class. On the other hand, perhaps I notice that maybe just a few students are struggling with a particular skill. I can pull those students aside during play or right before play and read that social story and discuss that social story with just those kids. However, more often than not, I'm reaching into my social story collection to address a behavior that an individual child is displaying. So, right at the beginning of our playtime, I will pull that child aside, read and discuss a social story, and then send them off to play. If you're able to read and discuss the social story and address the behavior immediately before play, I've found that that's most effective because it's fresh in their minds, and then you're giving them a chance to practice the strategies that you're trying to teach the child. Now we're moving into step number 4 of the 5-part framework, but remember steps 4 and 5 happen at the same time. So step number 4 is to provide the child with opportunities to practice the skill through purposeful play. Let's get into some specifics. As I previously mentioned, I typically read social stories with children immediately before play during our play workshop block, which happens in the middle of our day every single day, Monday through Friday. However, there are other opportunities for open play that allow me to observe and support the child. Here are some other examples. Morning play. This happens right as students enter our classroom. Yes, I am taking attendance. Yes, I am connecting with colleagues as necessary. But for the most part, this is an open-ended playtime when I can observe and guide and support children during play. Perhaps you also have a block of time during that arrival part of your school day where you can allow your children to play and you can support during that play. Another alternative is recess. If you find it challenging to focus on one child during open-ended play in your classroom, consider using recess as that time. This is especially useful if you are not on recess duty and you can just be an observer and supporter. And if none of those options work for you, consider observing and supporting during specialists. This can happen during gym, music, art, STEM, whatever specialist your children get to attend. Because you are not the teacher in the spotlight during this time, that allows you to really be there for that child and support when that undesirable behavior flares up. Now, hear me out. I totally get it. As a busy teacher, you do not want to give up your prep time to go support a child during their specialist time. But the attention that you give this child and the support that you give this child during that specialist time can pay off in dividends. So yes, it might be difficult for you to give up that prep time in the moment, but trust me, you will be so glad you did. Step number 5 of the 5-part framework is to support that child during the play as needed. Now, of course, if you don't see the behavior flare up, you don't need to step in, but if you do, that's when you come in to guide. If you're thinking to yourself, Amber, I don't know what to say to guide the child, I don't know how to support, then this slide is for you because I'm going to give you a very specific strategy that you can use in those tense moments. Try to memorize what you're going to say so that the response automatically comes to you. Personally, I've found that when an undesirable behavior keeps occurring over and over again, I personally can get frustrated. Maybe not outwardly, but inwardly, I can get frustrated too. And I don't want that frustration to come out. I want to approach the child in a supportive way. So, one way that I can tame my own frustration is by having an automatic response that I memorize when I'm approaching the child when he or she is displaying that undesirable behavior. The method that I personally use is called the flip it strategy, and this comes from Rachel Wagner. I've included a relevant link that you can go to learn more about her and the flip it method. But basically, the flip it method has 4 steps, 4 things you say when you're supporting the child in the moment. FLIP is an acronym that stands for feelings, limits, inquiries, and props. In this photo, you can see a little visual that I literally keep at my teacher table as a visual reminder to help me remember the flip it strategy. Yes, I do have it memorized, but sometimes it's helpful just to go back and remember, okay, this is what I'm going to say. So the F stands for feelings. This is where you address the feelings that you think the child is displaying or having. For example, that can sound like this. I see that you are crossing your arms and you're stomping your foot. I see you are, and then you name the behavior. Then you try to narrow in on the feeling that the child might be having. I wonder if you are feeling angry. It's important to try to help the child identify the feeling that they're experiencing. If you're able to identify it and acknowledge it, then the child is more likely to problem solve with you moving forward. For example, you say, I wonder if you're feeling angry. And the child says to you, no, I wonder if you're feeling frustrated. I wonder if you're feeling sad. And then keep going until the child agrees with the feeling that you've named. The L in the flip method stands for limits. In other words, you're naming the limits of the classroom. You might say something like, in our classroom, we use our words to express what we want or need. The I in the flip it method stands for inquiries. In other words, you're helping the child come up with a strategy to solve the problem. It could sound like, how can we solve this problem? Or maybe in my example, you could say something like, what words could we use to ask for what we want or need? Finally, the P in the flip it method stands for prompts. So if the child is not able to come up with a solution on their own, this is where you would give some suggestions. For example, maybe you might say, maybe you could tell your friend, could I have a turn with that dinosaur when you're done? So in a nutshell, that's the flip it method. But again, if you're interested in learning more about it, I suggest you check out that link from Rachel Wagner. As a reminder, you don't need to use the flip it method. This is just a suggestion that I personally use in my classroom so that I'm ready and prepared to step in and support students in those heat of the moment situations. So again, here is an example of what the flip it method could sound like. When you're naming the feeling, it might sound like, I see you're crossing your arms. I wonder if you're feeling angry. When you go to set the limit, it could sound like, in our classroom, we use our words to ask for what we want or need. The next step is to set the limits. You can say, how can we solve this problem? And finally, as needed, provide some prompts or suggestions. That might sound like this. Maybe use your strong, assertive words to ask your friend if you could have a turn with the truck when you're all done. Here's a big tip. If you are providing the child with some suggestions or prompts, think back to the social story that you read with the child before play began. What strategies or tools did the social story suggest? This is where you can suggest those strategies to the child in the moment. One more thing. Before you wrap up playtime, perhaps right before you clean up or right after you clean up, or maybe as the children are transitioning, try to reflect with the child. If something went really well or the child tried out a strategy that you were discussing with him or her, acknowledge that. You can simply say something like, I noticed that you used your words when you asked for that dinosaur. And then give a high five or a fist bump. A little bit of reflection and acknowledgement could go a long way if you want to see that continued positive behavior. I am going to keep things real with you. Reading a social story and discussing it with a student once probably isn't going to do the trick. This is going to be a practice that you're going to come back to again until you're seeing an improvement. For example, at the beginning of the school year, a child in our classroom was basically stealing things from our classroom, placing them in her pockets with the intention of taking them home with her. Naturally, I read a social story to her about taking things without permission and discussed it and helped her connect to the social story, provided her with strategies of what to do instead when she feels the urge to take things that don't belong to her. But did that one read aloud and that one discussion solve the problem? Did she stop stealing after that? No, of course not. So then we had to go through the cycle again. I would observe the behavior, support in the moment, reread the social story, have another discussion, talk to her about what's going on, why she did it, what was she thinking in that moment, what was she feeling in that moment. And then I did give her more opportunities to go back and play and try again. And then, of course, I would support her as needed. In summary, keep in mind that this is not a one and done thing. It is going to be a process until you see a general improvement. Before we wrap up, let's go back to that quote from Sarah Boyd. Beneath misbehavior often lies a struggling child who is aware that they are not meeting expectations, but unaware or unequipped on how to do so. So this is why social stories work. In my experience as a 4K teacher, I've seen so many children receive the social story read aloud and discussion really well. And I think it's because they feel seen in a really positive and supportive way. I believe that when I work with a child one on one or in a small group, and I'm coming at them with a positive and caring tone, the child really sees that I'm trying to support them and help them improve on the behavior. Going through this process will help your children feel more equipped to make positive choices in school. I want to leave you with a couple of resources. First, let's quickly talk about Carol Gray. She's sort of the queen or the founder of social stories. Carol Gray was a teacher in the 1970s and later years as well, and she developed this whole social stories idea in the 1990s. She created these social stories and she found that her children connected to them and the social stories really supported them in navigating life. If you're interested in learning more about Carol Gray or learning more about social stories, I highly recommend you visit her website, and I've included the link here on the slide. Here's one more resource. I've actually written an article about social stories and how you can use them in the general education classroom. You can find this article on the Edutopia website. It's titled Using Social Stories to Teach Procedures and Routines in Preschool. Now, I did not choose that title. The Edutopia editor selected that title. I'm not in love with it because social stories are not just specific to preschool children. Personally, I found that social stories are highly effective in pre-K and kindergarten classrooms. I would suggest even first and second grade. Anyway, you can find this article that I wrote on Edutopia by using the link provided on the slide, or you can simply Google Edutopia social stories and the article should pop up. I hope by reading the article, you gain additional insight on how you can use social stories in your classroom. I don't want to leave you hanging, so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you about social stories, purposeful play, play workshop, or just play-based learning in general. Here's all my contact information, my website, my Instagram, Facebook, email. I also send out a weekly email on Wednesdays called the Play Workshop Provocation email. I always jam pack it with value, value, value. I often get positive feedback from other teachers who look forward to receiving this email. It's not just junk in your inbox. So I do encourage you to use this link and sign up for the weekly Play Workshop Provocation email. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for being here and for sticking until the end. I genuinely hope that this framework and this strategy of using social stories tied in with purposeful play helps you support the children in your classroom so you can get off of that behavior management hamster wheel. Again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And until then, see ya.